So, we're continuing to talk through the book of Luke. And we've done this because we want to be shaped by Jesus. We literally want our lives to look more like Jesus than anything else. And so, as a church, we're just walking through the Gospel of Luke, which is the most thorough gospel. It's written by a physician who researched all the stories about Jesus, and he put the most important ones together in Luke. And so we're going through this slowly because we just want to look at what it must have felt like and been like to be around Jesus. Today, we get to hear the story of the first disciples who chose Jesus. And I've entitled this talk, Follow Me. And as I was thinking about this talk, I couldn't help but think of hunting season this year. So my boy Chaz in the back, I asked if I could share this story because it just epitomizes what it looks like to follow something with your whole heart. So here's the backstory. A couple buddies and I, we were archery hunting up by Silverton's. We were back in the woods. There's no service. And that morning we had seen some elk, and so we stalked into our place where we wanted to do our setup. And how we like to do setups, if you haven't ever elk hunted for archery before, this is what you do. You've got one caller who makes himself sound like an elk. And I know that sounds absurd, but you can actually do it, right? There's little mouth reeds that you put in, and you get like a wiffle ball bat, just like the one you used when you were 2 years old. And you just cut the end off, and you can blow into it in such a way that sounds like an elk. So we had my buddy Malachi, and he was making elk noises. Chaz was over in this corner. My other buddy was in this corner, and I was up at the top. So Malachi's making noises, and I didn't see all this transpire, but what happened is as Malachi's making these noises, all of a sudden he sees Chaz come running across the field. His stuff is gone. It's not there anymore. It's just him and his bow. And he's running with an arrow nocked like this. And he runs, and nobody else knew what was happening. Two of the other hunting buddies saw this happen. Both of them did little cow chirps, which is our way of communicating in the woods. It's also the elk way of communicating in the woods. But they communicated to Chaz like, meow, what's happening? Meow. And Chaz just looked and kept running. And so he disappears. And so we had decided that we were going to meet up about 10 minutes later. I didn't know any of this. I just waited, didn't see any elk come. So I meet up where we're supposed to meet. I'm waiting. Finally, the two other dudes, but not Chaz, show up. And we're like, okay, what's happening? Where's Chaz? And they're like, I don't know. I think he saw something, but we're not sure. And so we're like, right as this happens, we see two other hunters come down exactly where we're hunting and go for the area that we're protecting. And so we're like, now we have this terrible decision. Do we wait for Chaz, our hunting buddy, or do we cut these guys off to the spot that we saw the animals? And I don't know if this was the right decision or not, but we didn't have to think about it at all. We hoofed it up the hill. We just like, Chaz will figure it out. Hopefully, if he gets an animal, he'll like make some noise and we'll figure, he knew where we were going. We just take off. So we take off and we get a head of these other hunters. We're steaming mad, honestly, because these guys should know better. There's only one corridor if you want to hunt that basin, and these guys are trying to cut us off. So we race up there. We get ahead of them. We talk the other hunters down in very Christian types of ways. And then we wait for Chaz. All right, so now it's like 2 hours later. And we're like, where's our boy? And we're just going through that decision of like, do we go back down the hill and give up our spot? Or do we just go hunt? And of course, we decided to just go hunt. And so we ended up hunting all day and never saw Chaz. And we're like, I hope this dude has got like 3 elk. No, only 1 elk. But like already skinned, taken, like this dude probably got it. So anyway, it's like late afternoon. We're coming back down. Again, we have no way to communicate. And we're coming down and we hear and then see Chaz coming down the mountain. So we finally link up and we're like, dude, what happened? And he's like, did you see that moose? And I was like, the moose? He's like, oh, you didn't see it? Like, no. Like, are you telling the truth? And he goes on to tell us that he had seen a cow elk and its little fawn? Calf, thank you. Sees the cow and the calf. He chases him down through the woods. He sneaks up on him, gets around the corner. It's all tiptoe, silent type, Rambo style. He gets in at 10 yards, goes to draw, and looks again at the animal. And it's a moose, a mama moose, that's looking at him, pissed off at the world. And Chaz is like, and he said he just took off. He just didn't drop the bow, did you? No, he just took off running in the other direction. And then he just was so kind of flummoxed that he just like decided to hunt the other area, and we never reconnected. Man, you can imagine, like we were like, well, first of all, what I got to say is I love hunting with Chaz, because Chaz is this guy that when he sees something, nothing is going to stop him going to get it. Isn't that how you are, Chaz? Yep. Chaz is the guy that there is no mountain too high or valley too low to chase an elk down. This dude just gets it. And when he gets it as a hunting partner, you're kind of like, I hope he got it, because I probably ain't going to find him, right? And I thought about that because it's so similar to what Jesus asked of Peter in the text that we're about to read. See, what we see in this text is Peter is doing his thing. He's doing his normal life. And in his normal life, there's all the routines and things you should do, right? There's all the ways that you should act. He had his job. He had his social cues. He had his parents and his family and their business. And he was doing all of that stuff until Jesus came in. And in a moment, Jesus changed the whole narrative. And Peter had the choice. I'm either going to follow this guy or let him go. I'm either going to give everything in the direction of Jesus, and there's going to be consequences. There's going to be people, my fishing partners, who are going to be like, what are you doing? Where are you going? We didn't talk about this. There was no contingency for this. And yet, Peter, you'll see in the story, he chose that following Jesus was better than anything else he could have been doing with his time. Now, as we talk about this, we're going to bring up two, I think, very helpful subjects for our culture and for our life today. First, it's the idea of polarization. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except for me. And we live in a world that is extremely polarized. And at first glance, you would almost think that Jesus encourages the polarization, right? Like he says, you're with me or you're not. Either you come and die or you don't come at all. That's the kind of words that Jesus used. And so today I want to talk about, as we dig into this, how can we follow Jesus and address the polarization in our culture? The second thing I want to talk about that I think will also be helpful is, what does it look like to follow Jesus today? Right? Because then you actually followed the living and breathing human named Jesus, right? But now I've actually had numerous people ask me this. What do you mean when you say follow Jesus, right? If you don't grow up in the church, you look at that and you sort of say, how am I supposed to follow a Middle Eastern guy from 2,000 years ago? And so I want to try to make that practical in ways that the story elaborates. So with that, why don't we jump in and read the story? It comes out of Luke chapter 5. You can follow along on the screen behind me. And this is how it goes. One day, as Jesus was preaching on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, great crowds pressed in on him to listen to the word of God. He noticed 2 empty boats at the water's edge, for the fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. Stepping into one of the boats, Jesus asked Simon, its owner, to push it out into the water, so he sat in the boat and taught the crowds from there. This story is a very easy to follow story, and it just comes alive. And the first part of it is really brilliant, really. Jesus knew that if he was going to be in the water, his voice would amplify. And so have you ever read the scripture and seen that Jesus talked to like 5,000 people and sort of wondered, like, how did he do that? You know? And he employed like just practical, sneaky little tips like this, where he got in a boat and he went away from shore. And that way, when he talked, his voice would amplify so that everybody could hear him speaking. He would have been able to speak longer, and he would have been able to speak in a way that more people could hear. And so, as a byproduct, we've got a picture that Simon's in the boat, sort of drumming his feet, right? Because that's all we see Simon as at this point. Simon is a fisherman. So for a living, he would have gotten up for the night fishing session. And in the Sea of Galilee, the types of fish would school together at night, and so they would throw nets to catch more than one fish at a time in the areas that these fish would school together. And then at the morning, when the night had gone and the sun had come up and the fish were scattering because of predators, then the fishermen would come in. So at this point, we don't even know if Jesus has heard anything about Jesus. But what we know is he hears his sermon, right? Peter's sitting in the boat, listening. He's catching the vibe that Jesus is given. Now, when he had finished speaking, Jesus said to Simon, "Now go out where it's deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish." "Master," Simon replied, "we worked hard all last night and didn't catch a thing." This is where it gets interesting. "But if you say so, I'll let the nets down again." Now, this is the only thing we see so far about Simon Peter, and we're going to catch more of this in his story. If you continue to read in the gospel journey, we see that Peter is the guy that's a jump first, think second kind of guy. Have you noticed that about Peter? I think Jesus knew this and loved this about Peter. And so when he called him and chose him, he saw this part of him, and he just honored it. He loved it. He loved that Peter was willing to do stuff even if it didn't make sense. Because if it's me and I'd been up all night and I finally got done with the long, maybe kind of boring sermon, I'm ready to go in. And if a rabbi who's a teacher of God's word thinks he's going to tell me how to fish, me who does it every day of my life with my parents who did it every day of their life, like this rabbi has something different coming to him. This is not going anywhere. And yet it does. This time, their nets were so full of fish that they began to tear. A shout for help brought their partners to the other boat, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. It's quite a picture, isn't it? It's quite an amazing picture. You just think about the time that has to elapse. They're out in the a ways out in the shore or out from the shore, and they're catching. They realize they have so much fish, they need their friends, so their friends paddle out, and you can imagine they're excited and yelling back and forth. And meanwhile, Jesus is now on the shore, so they must have taken some time to drop off the rabbi so he didn't get sticky with fish or whatever, and so they go out and they start dragging in this incredible catch that almost sinks the boats. Can you imagine that? Have you ever been in a boat that almost sank? Just remember that moment. You remember trying to balance and keep it up, and fish, they're little, slithery things, right? They're not balancing at all. And so this is just kind of a comical moment. It's kind of an interesting moment. It's an amazing moment. And right at this moment, Simon Peter realizes something more is going on with this guy Jesus than just being a rabbi, just another one of those guys talking about God. When Simon Peter realized what had happened, he fell on his knees before Jesus and said, "Oh Lord, please leave me. I'm such a sinful man." I want to come back to this, but does this strike you as odd? Let me tell you, maybe at first glance it does, but for me it doesn't strike me as odd. You know why? Like, I know my soul. I'm the one that has to live my life. Other people, you see what I put out on the outside, but I know who I am on the inside. And I can understand being in a moment where you are convinced that you are in front of the divine God of the universe and just recognizing I have no place with you. You know who I really am, and surely you do not want me. I mean, this is one of our core fears as human, right? That we're just not good enough or that we're a failure. And that can spring into all kinds of things, right? From being a parent to being an employee, just lots of things. But it certainly centers before God, doesn't it? God who knows truly who we are. This again shows a lot about the type of person that Peter was. Yeah, maybe he didn't think a lot. Maybe he was kind of impulsive, but he was honest. He was true. It says that he was immediately awestruck by the number of fish that was caught, as were the others with him. His partners, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were also amazed. But Jesus replied to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fishing for people." And this is where the famous line comes from. As soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. Let me read that one more time, just because I think we have to grasp what actually happened. As soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. The stinky fish, they left them. This is wild. That doesn't make any sense. At least go to the market first and sell the big catch so that you have hotel money on the journey, right? Or what about your parents? I often wonder, did the biblical writers, did they exaggerate, or is this what actually happened? Were they that taken by this story, by Jesus, that they literally left it all? That they ran through the woods with the bow? Just one focus, that's it, one focus. Now, let me just ask this as we jump into what I want to talk about. Is that possible for us? Us with our complex lives, long histories, thorough resumes. Is this story relevant at all? I want to try to argue that it is. I've got 2 points today that I want to talk about, 2 points that I think help us understand what's happening here and then translate to us today. The first is this: to follow Jesus is to make him your master. To follow Jesus is to make him your master. This is why I think at some level it's kind of complex in our world to understand what it means to follow Jesus. Because we don't live in a world where there are masters like this. Yeah, we have bosses and parents, but in America, we prize being independent. We prize leaving and disconnecting from all of the systems that hold us down. And so to think about masters being a good thing is actually kind of complex. We don't really know how to do that well, but in their culture, this would have been a normal thing. And despite what we think about the first century, there were a number of great masters, right? All slavery in that culture was not bad. And that's a wild thing to think, because we just sort of assume that the way that oppression worked and the hierarchy worked of power, we just assumed it was all negative. But there were plenty of masters in that day and age who cared for their servants and their slaves. And they actually gave their lives to making sure that these servants and slaves could thrive. And in the same way, the whole rabbi system was based on this concept. What would happen is a rabbi would go and they would select out of the best of the best religious kids, a few kids who would get to follow the rabbi around and find their life as a rabbi someday. This is how they were taught. They didn't have schools like we do. They didn't go and take grades and tests. They just literally dropped everything with the blessings of their family, and they would follow the rabbi, trying to become like the rabbi in every way. I mean, literally, there's stories about kids learning to walk with the same limp that their masters had because they wanted to emulate everything of that rabbi. Peter knew this. Every Jewish kid in this culture would have known this. And so when a rabbi came and said, "Follow me," this would have meant something. Peter would have known that he didn't do that well in his early grade school years. See, in those days, every kid had to memorize the Torah. Every kid. Not some of the kids. Every kid. That's the first 5 books of the Bible, including Leviticus, which if you've ever read Leviticus, it's not that easy to memorize. This is an incredibly daunting task that you would have had to do by 12. And then if you passed that and passed that well, you would go on to memorize further sections of the scriptures. And it was that rubric that teachers would use to pick the young next rabbis. And so there was a grading system, and there was posturing, and kids wanted more than anything else to be like this. And most of them failed. 95%, more than 95%, failed in their quest to be chosen by a rabbi. And so in this moment, when Peter is looked at by Jesus and Jesus says, "Come and follow me," all of a sudden his chest would have puffed out. And he would have said, "Really? Me? Like you?" He would have heard his teaching. He would have caught the rubrics and the ideas, the ways that Jesus was talking about the kingdom. He would have seen the surprised look on everybody's faces. And this sparked something way bigger in his story and his life than just going and doing something, right? Doing a job. All of a sudden he was like, I could make a difference. Me. But he knew within that he had to give up everything. And so he had this moment, this choice, where it's like, do I keep what I've built till now, or do I give it up and follow Jesus? Of course, he chose to follow. And what he would have implicitly been saying is, I am giving up my life. That's why later Jesus said in Matthew 16:24, he said this, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Peter knew, and what I would submit to you today, that following Jesus fundamentally means to choose Jesus as our master. Now, this master is not as present as you and I would probably like, right? We don't get to follow his limp, and we don't get to eat with the same hand that he eats, right? We don't get to do some of those physical things, and so it might seem complex and confusing to be a follower of Jesus. But I would say we can actually just boil this down and say, who is the master of our life? All of us have a master, and that master dictates what we try to live up to be. The easiest way for me to see the masters that I live for is to look back when I first chose Jesus as my master. I was in college. I was a freshman. I was at this little Christian school, and I'd been trying to do a number of things that had been my value. I was an athlete, but my back was injured. I was a social kid, but it just wasn't working out. I was not really fitting in with the crowd. And it was in that moment when I realized that my masters, or the things that I lived for others, they weren't working. And it was a chapel message I heard, where I heard the message of Jesus dying on the cross for my sins, giving me an opportunity to make him my master, to start reshaping my life based on everything that he said instead of what I wanted out of my life. And I remember that was too good of an offer to give up. In fact, I actually remember being in my dorm room saying, God, I don't really have anything to give to you. Like, you picked a pretty crappy servant, but I'm in. I want what you have. And that started a shaping journey for me, where I started to learn what it looked like. And I remember at the beginning it was exciting, but what it looked like to have Jesus be my master. It spanned all of my life, my friendships, how I thought about dating, how I thought about money, what I thought about my job and career, my time. I started volunteering at this inner city kids thing, and these kids were hellions. They were. There's no better word to describe them. They just were rambunctious. They didn't listen. They were inner city kids, and I just couldn't wait to go and love on these kids. I'd never done that in my life, ever, up until that point. But all of a sudden, I couldn't think of anything better than helping someone else find love and a way through life. That changed because Jesus became my master. I remember when I read, this was like almost right after I had chosen this way, I read the scripture that said, don't store up for your treasures here on earth, where thieves will break in and steal, and rust will destroy it, and moths. And much to the chagrin of my parents, I just went and emptied out my bank account. I was like, hey, Jesus said not to have bank accounts. So all right, I had a little bit of work to figure that out, but I remember the exhilaration of being like, okay, master, are you going to provide? You said you would. Actually, I remember taking all that money out, and it was like $10. It was not very much money. But I just went to a homeless dude and was like, here. Again, probably not the best use of the money, but at the time, I just remember feeling so overtaken by what it looked like to give up on serving myself and all this expectation of the world around me and just to follow Jesus as my master. I started reading the scriptures. A friend and I started getting up early. We'd read the scriptures and then we'd pray for an hour. And we did this every single day because I couldn't get enough of these words. These words were just jumping out, inspiring me to live this radically different life. I was happy to deny myself. I was not thinking about all the things that I was losing because I was following Jesus. I was captured by his story, and I wanted more of it. And I think that's what the story is. Now, what I'll say is, if you hang out with me today, it doesn't look like that very often. You know, life has a way of changing, and we shift, and we have to mature, and then all of a sudden God gives us things to steward, and we can't just give all our stuff away. We actually have to steward it in wise ways, and it becomes complex, and yet we still have Jesus as our master. And then you get kids and a family and a job, and you have all these things to take care of that are complex, and yet you still have Jesus as your master. What does it look like to follow this king today? I think today it's just a reminder of the simplicity of saying, whatever you say goes. I may not know what that is, God, but whatever you say goes. I may have to research. I may have to talk to wise, godly people. I may have to read the scriptures over and over to interpret them into my life. I may need to talk to a counselor and wrestle with some stuff that's bogging me down. But regardless, I am now choosing to do what you want instead of me. This is what trips me up about so many social conversation of our day and age. Very rarely do you hear somebody say, I just am submitting to my life to whatever God wants. You know, we start talking about all the hot topics of, I'm not going to name them because it just triggers people. But, we get all these topics, and I'm just waiting for somebody to say, I'm not labeled by any of that. My allegiance is to Jesus. That's what Peter did. And that kind of brings me to the next thing that I want to talk about for a few minutes. And that is polarization, right? Because it seems like Jesus encourages polarization. And I don't know about you, but I hate polarization. Like our culture, the way everybody is so against each other and fighting for their way and how they're right, it would almost seem like Jesus is advocating, yeah, that's how it is. And let's think about the story for a second. What does Peter do? He kind of polarizes himself against his family, right? Now instead of going to family things, he's going with Jesus. He's letting go of the master that was his master, which was his father, who would have been apprenticing him in the trade of fishing. He let go of that apprentice so that he could be apprenticed by Jesus. That's gonna cause issues. And so this is my second point. To follow Jesus will polarize you from people. But Jesus forces us to jump the divide. That's my second point. To follow Jesus will polarize people. It just will. It's going to polarize you from people, almost like as a result. And we don't like that. I don't like that. I mean, I'll just be really honest. Still to this day, when people ask me what I do for a job, and I say, I'm a pastor of a church in town, most of the time, people look at me like I'm crazy. They're just like, isn't that like one of those things that our culture used to do, but now we're way smarter than that. We don't do that anymore. They just look at me differently, and I don't like that. I like people. I like people to like me. And so when people are divided because of choices I make, it inherently makes me feel uncomfortable. Right? There, I said it. But if you continue along the journey with Jesus, and I'll get to this in a second, Jesus teaches us how to jump that divide. So, first, let's talk about polarization for a second. Polarization means when something is pushed to opposites. It's actually a word that's used way more in science than even in our social culture. But when we think about in our social culture, social polarization is the segregation within a society that emerges when factors result in differentiation of social groups. All right, so essentially what happens is as we're living life and doing our things, and people have different belief systems and ideas of ways of living and fixing problems, and also they have different stories and backgrounds and histories, that has a way of causing us as humans to start to look for people that are like us. And social polarization is when those groups form in cliques in such a way that there's exclusion from group to group. This is just a natural way of being human. And what I have to say to us today is if you don't like polarization, start praying for heaven. Because there is nothing on this earth that can prevent polarization from happening in humanity. It is just a natural way of the world. We need to get used to it. We need to get used to the fact that some people are just not going to agree with what we do. With the reality that when we choose Jesus as our master, someone else is choosing a different thing as their master. And that makes us have two different masters. And when we have different masters, we have different actions, different morality, different ways of talking, different ways of thinking, spending our time, our money, solving problems in the world. That's just how the world works. And it's everywhere. And I think the sooner we as Christians can accept the world in this way as it is, the sooner we can just breathe and be like, it's okay. I'm different. I don't have to explain myself every time. I don't have to say this in a politically correct every single time kind of way. I can just be me. And part of me is going to alienate people. That's okay. It's just how the world is. But where this ends is what Jesus called Peter to. See, this is what's so great we need to remember about the story. What did actually Jesus say he was calling Peter to do? He said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. Now, at first glance, you may look at that and be like, what is that? Some kind of like manipulative, like, I don't know, marketing scheme? Like where I'm going around trying to convince people and catch them on my line? Right? I think if we take this a little too far, it can get really weird, right? Where we're just like, I'm catching everyone to my thing. But if you look at the rest of the narrative and you just start following, well, what did Jesus mean when he said, I would help you catch people? You see over and over and over that Jesus was crossing divides for people. In fact, I think one of the most compelling things about the gospel of Jesus is that he didn't just preach a gospel to us, he lived that by coming into our life. He didn't wait for us to come to him. He came to us. I would say it like this. He's not waiting for you. He's actively chasing you down. So much so that he was willing to put his skin in the game. His two wrists and his feet with nails pounded to a tree. The way Jesus crossed divides is absurd. The standard is so high, you realize, oh, Jesus is not actually okay with polarization. Yes, we are going to be divided. And yes, he's going to do everything he can to love the lost, the least, and the broken. And that's what he did. Can you imagine being Peter and just watching Jesus interact with people? Like the time that Jesus went over and hugged the leprosy guy. That's a moment where if I'm Peter, I'm like, yeah, back a little bit, master. You're going to get sick and then get us sick. But Jesus didn't function that way. He didn't look at people like outcasts. He didn't see people either as projects. He jumped into their stories. Like the woman at the well who'd been married 6 times or 7 or, and he jumps in embracing this woman by talking to her, which in that culture would have just been radically different than what you were supposed to do. Or just all the times that he cared for the blind man, or the person that was stuck as a cripple, or even the people who couldn't speak. It was almost like Jesus had a mission of finding those people who were lost, who were the least, and who were broken. And he gave his life to that. Most of the time when the polarizing conversations were happening, you know what Jesus did? He's just like, I ain't got time for this. There's that person right over there that needs love. He gave his life to serve people. What would Peter have seen as a follower of Jesus? He would have just seen this radical compassion and care for people. And so that's what it meant for Peter. But Peter didn't get it right all the time. Did you know that? If you're thinking here that, okay, following Jesus, I need to be like Peter in this one story, well, you can do that. But you've got to know you're going to screw up a lot. Peter did. Even at the most important moment of his life, when Jesus was being led to the cross, Peter 3 times says, I don't know who that guy is. I want nothing to do with him. And in a story that is one of the most compelling stories in the scriptures, it's found in John 21. Jesus, after he dies and resurrected, and Peter has now distanced himself from Jesus and is back fishing, Peter shows back up on the scene to redo the story we just read. Check this out. At John 21, 4 through 6, it says this. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach. Catch that? At dawn, Peter would have been fishing all night, similar to the other time. And Jesus was standing at the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, fellows, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. And then he said, throw out your net on the right side of the boat and you'll get some. So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Sound familiar? Anyone? Jesus once again reminding Peter that he was never going to give up on him as his follower. Just the same way that Jesus never gives up on you and I. The next part of the scene is so compelling because this is when Peter sees that it's Jesus. He recognizes, he's like, I know this story. And what's he do? He jumps out of the boat and starts swimming to Jesus. Now he's no longer reserved. There's no more thoughts. He's in. He wants everything that Jesus has for him. And Jesus reminds him, you got this. You're my follower. Feed my sheep. Tend to my lambs. Take care of my church. I want to close by just saying this. All of us, I think at different frequencies of our life, need to reevaluate, who am I following? And for some of us, we just have never followed Jesus. And so this is a new thing. This is a new invitation. And what I would encourage you to do is just ask yourself this question. Is the master that I follow worthy of my attention? For others of us, we chose a while ago to follow Jesus. But maybe we've gotten a little wishy-washy with it. Maybe we've let some of those masters creep back in. I'll echo the words of Jesus when he confronted Peter back that I read earlier. Jesus replied to Simon, do not be afraid. Friends, I would tell you tonight, don't be afraid when it comes to following Jesus. If he stirred and captured your heart, give him everything again. Sell it all in every practical way that he is asking you to. Be willing to make him master of every area of your life. And if you do and I do, I think we're in for a wild ride together. So to close, I've got something special for us. We've got a couple people getting baptized directly following this. And I just asked them to come up and share why they chose to make Jesus their master. So we've got Rob and Aaron. Would you guys come up and just tell us why you've chosen to make Jesus your master? And then while they're coming up, let me just tell you the details. So we are going to the river to do a baptism directly following this. So I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes. I know, it's kind of crazy. I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes to rally your kids and do your stuff. Less talking today. No talkie-talkie. We're going to go together to 32nd Street. I'm literally going to park my truck with the headlights on the river, and we're going to go get wet together, celebrating Jesus and his reborn life. So, Rob, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so my name's Robert Holmes, and last night DJ said in his text message, the question is,
8 years? 9 years? We've been hanging, talking about? Yeah.
telling him how I don't believe in Jesus, all that stuff. And he's loved me just the same, no matter what. And that's something that really attracted me to this church. And I've had nothing but unconditional love from all the people in this church, and just letting me have my spiritual journey. And yeah, so I mean, my ego wants me to be my own master. That's what I believe. And but the more and more I come to church and speak to other people about God and the way that I look at it, my mind has been opened, my heart's been opened, and my heart absolutely wants to be wants to let go of what I think is best for me and follow something that is greater than myself. And so yeah, I was thinking every time I come to church, all the messages that I hear, I absolutely agree with all of them, and I
Huh.
have to let go of my mind, of my thoughts that will separate me from you guys, or the thoughts that I don't believe this, I don't believe that. That will keep me apart from you guys and God forever. And what I've learned is I just have to follow my heart. My heart. What really made it sealed the deal for me is when you guys talk about serving the sick, the suffering, and the poor. And I absolutely align with that, and that just is really what I want to do with my life. And that seems like what this church, or what church and Jesus was all about. That's the best I can come up with. And so I absolutely want to do that with my life, and I want Jesus to show me the way. And so yeah, I absolutely want Jesus to be my master.
Oh, dude. Thank you. I love that.
I hate microphones. Hi back there. My name's Aaron Lombardo, and boy, it's been a great experience getting to meet DJ and all of you here, new family. Yeah, I realized just a few years ago, I'm 54, and realized that I had some abandonment issues, and I've been going through my whole life feeling super alone and sad a lot. But on the outside, I was this happy,
Yeah.
great, giving, loving person, but I never gave to myself. I was always trying to give for acceptance, right?
Yeah.
And seek attention. So that in turn caused a bunch of selfishness that hurt others and then myself. So I don't want to leave myself anymore. So that's why I'm here.
Love it. Love it. Thanks so much, guys. So church is sort of dismissed, But I hope you guys can join us. Yeah. Yeah, come on. Let's go. Give it up for Zane. Are you getting baptized too?
What's that?
Are you getting baptized too?
No, but